Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to talk about display, position, z-index, overflow, and how to align our elements on our web page. First of all, let's open our code editor. Here I got simple HTML file that has link to this CSS file, and we're going to open this with our live server. First of all, let's talk about display property. This is one of the important CSS properties for controlling the layout. The display property specifies how an element is displayed. Every HTML element has a default display value depending on what type of element it is. The default value for most elements is block or inline. And let's show you what's the difference between block and inline element. Let's say here we have a p tag right here. Lower pi here, okay. And then we have h1 with test heading right after that. Now, if I select all of the elements inside body and give the background color of, for example, black, you see both of these elements has taken the all width that they can do. But for example, let's change this color, for example, to red, so we can see the text too. If we have our span tag right here and write our text here, you see here we have our background just in this part and we don't have this anywhere else. And if I delete this part of our paragraph, you see empty space has taken by our paragraph tag, but we don't have in our span. So this type of elements which take all the width of the parent block when we use them is called block elements. And the elements which are like these that don't take all of the space and take only the space that it needs is called inline elements. But actually we can change the type of these too. For example, let's select our h1 tag right here and set the display property to inline. Now you see our h1 element is taking only the necessary space that it needs and no other empty spaces. For example, div heading tags, paragraph, form, header, footer, and section tags are block level elements, which always starts on a new line and takes up the full width available. And for inline elements, we can have something like span or anchor tag or our image tag. Let's say we have some other spans right here with the label of test1, test2, and test3. Test4 too. And let's delete these two. Another thing that we can do with our display property is we can set the display to hidden or none. For example, first let's give this an ID. I set the ID to S2. Okay, now here, if I select that S2, and if I want to hide this element, I can do with this property display, and in the value, I'm going to type none. Now, as you see, we have our test1, we have our test3, and test4, but we don't have our test2 right here. But sometimes maybe we want our test3 and test4 to be in their places like this. We want test3 to be here, test4 to be here, and we want the space of test2 to be blank space wide. To do that, we have another property that is very useful called visibility. And we can set this visibility to hidden, for example. Now you see we have all of the elements in their places, and our test2 span has taken the space what is now hidden, and we cannot see that. And if we change this, you can see now our test2 span came back. So let's create a simple web page so I can show you the usage of position property. First, let's have our margin and 0. First, we have our h1 here. Then we got our paragraph, for example, lorem 50 is enough here. Then we got our div, which we're going to use our position property on this div. And let's have this div text inside this. This is div actually. Okay. And then we have another paragraph with 150 words. Now let's select our div. Let's give this background of for example, blue, not black, blue. Let's make this a little lighter. Yes, this is good. Okay, first of all, we have 5 options in our position. First, let's talk about static. If I set our position into static, you see now if I scroll the web page, our block is behaving normally as it should be in normal. And this is the same as we don't have this line of code. Then after this, we have a thing called relative. What this is, basically this is going to behave by properties that we control it. For example, we have top here that we can set a space. For example, here I'm going to set 50 pixels right here. Now you see here, it has its own space taken right here, but it's actually 50 pixels below that space and showing right here. We can use the other values like left, for example, 10 pixels here. And after this, we have values like right and bottom, all 4 sides here, and they are just their name and the value that we want to have space. And we have all 4 sides that we can control this. After this one, we have another thing called fix. In this position, as you see, we don't have any space taken by our div. Actually, our div don't have a space in our web page, but it's a layer above our web page and showing right here. And if I scroll the web page, you see web page scrolling, but our div is not scrolling and fixed based on the size of our screen. Next thing we have is absolute value. When we use this, notice that in this value, as we had in fixed mode, we don't have any spaces taken by our div. And if we set the controls, for example, top 0 right here, you see it don't act from its space. Actually, it's going to apply in whole page and it sets top from the start of the web page. But in relative mode, we had our space of our div here. And if, for example, we set 10 pixels from it, it calculates 10 pixels from here to below. But in the absolute mode, the top is going to start from the top of our web page. Another thing that we have after these, we have this sticky mode, which is actually something between relative and fixed mode. For example, here, if you see I scroll the page, you see now we have this div acting normally. But if I, for example, set the top value of 50 pixels, now if I scroll down, if the space above our div to our Windows top, which is here, is going to be 50, then the div is going to act like fixed mode. You see? Now, after this, as I go, the block will not scroll and not change. But if I have more than 50 pixels right here on the top, you see I can do anything and the div is going to act normally as same as we don't have any position set to it. Now, let's say we have another div right here. This is div 1 and this is div 2. Let's give these class name D1 and D2. Now let's change this to D1. And then here we have our D2. Let's make this with red background. Yes, this is good. And maybe I give this width of 90 pixels. Now you see we have our first div changing and our second div stayed in its place. Let's say we want our second div's position to be in fixed mode. And we want this in top 50 pixel as our first div. You see now our second and red div is in the front of our first div, which is the below div. And our first div is actually in front of our all HTML paragraphs that we have behind these, as you see. To control this, we have something called z-index. For example, if I have z-index here and I give another index to D2, I can control it. And we control the z-index by number. For example, these all is z-index 0 right here as default. But if I change D1's z-index to 1, you see now we have our blue div above of our red div. Okay, now this is how you can see it. And if I change the z-index of D2 to, for example, number 3, you see now our red div again above of our blue div. And actually we can give these negative values so we send them back of our base web page. For example, if we set this to -1, now if I scroll, you see now our blue div is behind our paragraph. And actually we can set this to -2 so it can go to behind of our blue div and not show anything. Or maybe we can make this -2 and here we can have -1. Now we have this order of blue div and then red div in front of that, and then we have our base web page in front of those. Or we can have, for example, set the red div to z-index 1, and now we have another type of positioning these. Another thing that we're going to talk about is our overflow. For example, here in our paragraph, let's give this a border. 2 pixel, solid red. And if I give this a height of, for example, 150 pixels, you see now I have our border right here. I have these texts outside of my border. But if I don't want to see these, I can simply use overflow property. And if I set this to hidden, now you'll see I don't have these two. If I change this, for example, to 160 pixels, you see now we have all of our text which we can see until 160 pixels. And text after these are hidden and we can see them. But if we want to see them but our p tag take only this much space, we can use the value of scroll. And if we use this, you see now we got 2 scroll bars right here. And if I scroll along this scroll bar, I can see all of the text, but it don't get any more space than 160 pixels, which we have specified right here. But as you see here, we don't need this bottom bar. To fix this, we can use the auto mode. And if we use this, it automatically sets scroll bar where that we need them. For example, here we don't need any scroll bars. But if I have width of, for example, 80 pixels here, you see now we got this scroll bar too. And we have this one too. Another thing that we have is the float property, which specifies how an element should take places. For example, here we have basic and default settings that an element is going to take space from left to right. But if we use float here and set this to the right, you'll see now our element is going to take place and space from right to left. And we can set this into left mode as it was before, but pay attention that here we have changed the type of display of this block, which is now inline instead of block. As you see, if we don't have this float, we have this text in block mode, which taking all width that it can and available. But if we use float left or right, it don't matters. It's going to behave as inline. And if I set this into the right, you can see now we have this here. And let's say here we have another span which contains maybe 50 words here. And if I make this a little longer, for example, test for float, you'll see now this taking the space that it's necessary, and the rest of the space is going to take by the span ends from left to right as it can, and then it's going to continue in the bottom line and going on. Another thing that we're going to talk about is another value for display. We have covered block and inline values. For example, here let's say we want this display to be blocked as it is, which takes all of the space. Or we can make this inline, which takes only the space necessary. But pay attention, if I use margin right here and give this, for example, 20 pixels of margin, you'll see now we have this margin applied to the sides, left and right, but we don't have our margin on the top or bottom. To fix this issue, we can use this value of inline dash block, which is the block that's taking the space it's necessary. Now we have our left, right, top and bottom margins. We have controls on them, and also it's taking the space that it needs. Now let's say we have div here with the class name of D1, and then another div with class name of D2, and maybe one other with D3. First, let's select all divs, give the height of 50 pixels, for example, and the width of 100 pixels should be enough. And let's specify color for each of them. Now you'll see we have all of our three divs right here. But let's say we want to center these divs. What we can do is simply in D1, for example, we can use margin, and then in the value, if we set this to auto mode, you'll see now our div is going to be centered horizontally. Another way of centering the div is give the width by percent, for example. For example, let's say we want this to be 30% in this case. And then we can give this a margin of 35% in the sides and 0 in top and bottom. This is another way of making a div center. And let's say in the third one, we have span, which contains this text. Okay, now let's see how we are going to center this text inside our div. We can use both of these methods that we learned in D1 and D2, But there is another way of centering something inside a container, and we can use flexbox to do this. We are going to talk about flexbox later, but this is how you can center text inside it. First of all, we are going to set the display to flex. After this, here we can use justify content, and if I select center right here, you can see now our text is centered inside our div. And if we have text in all of these divs, and if we want all of these 3 divs to be centered in one line and take only the space that they need, we can use this flexbox action on the body, which is the container of these 3 divs. So here, first, we're going to select our body tag right here. And here, first, we're going to set the display to flex. And then here, we are going to set the justify content and set this to center. Now, if I remove the margins from these and the top one and the width of this as like this and this, now you can see we have all 3 divs in one line and they all taking only the space that they need to show. Let's comment this part, and if we have our D3 as normal right here, let's have all of these in normal. And now if we want to our text in all of our divs to be centered vertically and horizontally, we're going to use flexbox right here in div selector. First, we use the display and set this into flex mode. Okay, after this, we're going to use justify content and set this to center. This will center our text. And then in the next part, we are going to use align items, and if we center this, you see now we have our texts, all of them centered in our divs, vertically and horizontally. Please give a like and subscribe to catch next videos.